When my cousin Robert and I were in our early 20s, we made it a habit to go on camping trips around Ohio. We had a simple goal: avoid the weekend crowds. Robert, being the Eagle Scout, always took the lead, while I was more of a follower, content to let him handle the hard stuff. This particular trip was to Ural Forest. It was my first time camping there, though Robert had been before. We set out on a weekday, excited by the thought of having the woods all to ourselves. After a short hike, we found a perfect clearing, just big enough for our 2 tents, a portable stove, and a fire pit. Robert had his tent up in no time, while I fumbled with mine as usual. By the time I finally got my tent set up, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees. The sky took on that familiar golden glow, and the air was crisp, the kind of coolness that tells you nighttime is coming fast. Once the fire was crackling, Robert got to work cooking steaks and burgers. The smell filled the clearing, mixing with the wood smoke. I cracked open a beer, letting the warmth of the fire and the buzz of the alcohol settle in. Robert had the classic rock tunes playing on his speaker, and for a moment, it felt like everything was perfect. He always knew how to make these trips special, going all out on the food and the vibe. "People are the real danger out here," Robert said casually as he flipped a burger. "Not bears." At the time, I laughed it off. After dinner, we settled into the familiar routine of playing cards by the fire. The crackle of the flames and the occasional pop of the wood filled the silence between our laughter and casual conversation. Eventually, we switched to Uno, and the beers kept the night lighthearted. But that all changed when we heard it, low and distant at first, a humming sound. It was strange, almost like someone casually strolling through the woods, humming to themselves, completely unaware or unbothered by the fact that we were there. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, crunching slowly through the underbrush. I paused the music, letting the last notes of the song die out into an eerie silence. Robert gave me a quick look, his eyes wide with concern. I fumbled with my bag, searching for the flashlight, my heart starting to race. But by the time I clicked it on and shined the beam into the trees, the sounds had vanished, like they were never there. Robert brushed it off at first, like he always did. But even he admitted it was strange. There was no reason for anyone to be this deep in the forest, especially not at night. That was the moment when the uneasy feeling settled in. It was like a weight pressing down on the campsite, making everything feel a little too quiet, a little too still. We tried to go back to playing cards, but the mood had changed. The fun, carefree vibe was gone, replaced by tension that neither of us could shake. We barely spoke now, just focused on the game, trying to ignore the fact that something wasn't right. Then, without warning, a large stick came crashing into the middle of our campsite, landing with a heavy thud. Robert and I both jumped to our feet, startled. It hadn't fallen from a tree. It had been thrown. I looked around, my pulse hammering in my ears. Robert stood up, his voice loud and angry as he shouted into the darkness, "Whoever's out there, knock it off. Get a life and leave us alone." But the only response was more footsteps retreating into the forest, just beyond the reach of our firelight. We couldn't see anyone, couldn't tell how far away they were, or if they were even still there, watching us. Robert was on edge now, pacing around the fire, his eyes scanning the tree line. I suggested packing up and moving camp, but he shook his head. "We're not hiking out of here in the dark. We'll take turns keeping watch." He pulled out his bear spray and handed me mine. "Just in case." I agreed, though the thought of sleeping after what just happened seemed impossible. Robert insisted on taking the first watch, so I reluctantly crawled into my tent, bear spray clutched tightly in my hand. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented. My breath was shallow, and something felt wrong. The air inside my tent was thick with the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you strain to hear even the faintest sound. It was then that I noticed a shadow, a figure peering into my tent, a head silhouetted against the darkness. Groggily, I assumed it was Robert, waking me from my turn on watch. His face was indistinguishable, just a dark blur. "Is it my turn?" I mumbled, still half asleep. But the figure didn't respond. It just stared at me, unmoving, before slowly pulling back. The zipper of my tent closed with a soft, deliberate zip. Something about it gnawed at my gut, and it took me a few seconds to fully snap out of my fog. My mind clicked into clarity with a chilling realization. If that was Robert, why hadn't he said anything? My heart pounded against my ribs as I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The fire was nothing more than smoldering embers, casting barely enough light to make out the shapes of our tents. Robert's tent was zipped shut, completely undisturbed. A sinking dread washed over me. I rushed over, frantically unzipping his tent, and there he was, fast asleep, oblivious to everything. My blood turned to ice. That person who had been staring into my tent, wasn't Robert. I shook him awake, my voice a panicked whisper as I tried to explain what I'd seen. His eyes widened as the realization hit him too. Without saying a word, he grabbed his bear spray and handed me mine. "You're staying in my tent tonight," he said firmly, not leaving room for argument. But to do that, I needed my sleeping bag. I stepped out into the cold night air, my legs shaky as I hurried to grab it from my tent. That's when I heard it. The humming. Faint, but unmistakable. The same eerie tune from earlier, drifting through the trees. Only this time it was closer, more deliberate. My body froze, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were watching us. "Hurry up," Robert whispered urgently from behind me. His voice was tense, barely louder than a breath. I snatched my sleeping bag, and we quickly retreated to his tent, zipping it up tightly behind us. We sat there in the dark, the flimsy fabric walls feeling like a pathetic shield against whatever was lurking outside. The humming continued, faint but persistent, as though whoever was out there wanted us to know they hadn't left. Neither of us slept. We sat in Robert's tent, gripping our cans of bear spray, jumping at every crack of a twig or rustle of the wind. Every minute dragged by like an eternity, the night thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The humming would stop for a while, only to start up again, like a predator playing with its prey. I spent those hours praying for dawn, for any sign of daylight, to chase away whatever nightmare we had walked into. When the first hints of sunlight finally broke through the trees, we packed up camp faster than I thought possible. Neither of us spoke much as we hiked back to the car, our nerves fried and our eyes scanning the woods, just waiting for something or someone to step out of the shadows. It's been 6 years since that night, and I haven't been camping since. Robert has brought it up a few times, but I just can't do it. I can't shake the memory of that faceless head silently watching me in the dead of night. Camping used to be peaceful, an escape from the chaos of everyday life. But after that experience, I realized there's more to fear in the woods than bears or wild animals. It's the people you don't see, the ones who linger just out of sight, that keep me up at night. When my friends and I rented a beach house in Florida, I imagined it would be the perfect getaway. Sun, sand, and nothing to worry about. There were 4 of us, Ethan, Marcus, Daniel, and me, crammed into a car, excited for the weekend ahead. The house was tucked away on a quiet stretch of road, with the bay in front and the beach as our backyard. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple, cozy, 4-bedroom house with a clear beach theme in the decor. The owners had really leaned into the whole seaside vibe with seashells, surfboards, and starfish all over the place. But what really took our breath away was the view. Stepping out onto the back deck, you could see the beach stretching out endlessly in both directions, the ocean lapping at the shore just a few steps away. It was like having our own private slice of paradise. We spent the first day sprawled out on the sand, taking dips in the water and playing football like kids. It felt like the world had stopped, and we were the only ones there. Aside from an older couple we spotted far down the beach, we had the entire place to ourselves. That night, after grabbing dinner and hitting a few bars in town, we stumbled back to the house, still buzzing from the drinks and energy. Even though it was past midnight, we weren't ready to call it a night just yet. So, we decided to head back onto the beach, still tipsy, still laughing, and toss the football around under the moonlight. It was peaceful, the cool breeze coming off the water, the sound of the waves. But then something caught my eye. While running to catch the ball, I noticed a figure in the water. Someone standing waist deep in the ocean. The moonlight reflected off the surface, just enough for me to make out the shape. It was odd for sure, but I wasn't immediately alarmed. Maybe it was just a local enjoying a late-night swim. We shrugged it off, sat on the deck with a few more beers, and tried to laugh it away as the others slowly headed to bed. But Ethan and I stayed out a little longer. And as the night wore on, that weird feeling in the pit of my stomach started to grow. Something wasn't right. As Ethan and I sat on the deck, finishing the last of our beers, I couldn't shake this gnawing feeling creeping up on me like we weren't alone. The beach was quiet, just the steady sound of waves, nothing else. But something didn't feel right. I kept glancing toward the water, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of the deck lights, until I saw it. Someone was standing there, right at the edge of the beach, just outside the light's reach. Their figure was barely visible, but I could make out their silhouette facing us. I nudged Ethan, trying to stay calm. "You see that?" I asked. He followed my gaze, squinting, and then he saw it too. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't turn away. Just stood there, staring, it seemed, right at us. "Is everything okay?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. No reply. The figure stayed still, like it hadn't even heard me. We exchanged an uneasy glance, unsure of what to do next. There was something about the way it stood, so unnervingly still, that gave me chills. Ethan muttered, "Let's just go inside, man." Neither of us said anything more. We got up, leaving the figure on the beach as we slipped back into the house, locking the door behind us. I laughed it off, trying to convince myself it was just some weird local, or maybe even a drunk tourist, but deep down, I knew something was off. Back in my room, I brushed my teeth, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. What the hell were they doing out there? Just standing and staring. I told myself I was being paranoid, but as I climbed into bed, I felt the overwhelming urge to check the window one last time. I pulled back the curtain slightly, just enough to peek out. My heart nearly stopped. The figure was now standing at the edge of the deck, right where we had been sitting just minutes earlier. They were facing the house, facing *me*. I froze, unable to breathe, my hand still clutching the curtain. My heart raced in my chest as I stood there, staring at this unmoving silhouette. I called Ethan's name, my voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, come here. Now." He didn't respond right away, so I sprinted down the hall to his room, banging on his door. "Ethan, come on." He opened the door, groggy and annoyed, but I pulled him back to my window, pointing outside. But when we looked out, the figure was gone. Just empty sand and waves crashing in the distance. "I swear to God, someone was just standing there," I whispered. Ethan believed me, but neither of us wanted to go out there and check. We locked up every door and window, pulling the blinds shut tight. I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come. Every little sound in the house set my nerves on edge. Then came the knocking. It started as a light tap on the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, praying it was my imagination, but then it came again, this time louder, more deliberate. A fist, knocking right on my bedroom window. My body went cold. I couldn't bring myself to look. The tapping on the glass grew louder, each knock making my skin crawl. It felt like the entire house had gone still, like everything was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I stayed still, if I didn't make a sound, whatever was out there would just go away. But the knocking didn't stop. I wanted to scream, to tear open the blinds and face whatever was there, but something held me back. Some deep, primal fear telling me that whatever was outside, I did not want to see. I lay there, paralyzed, until I couldn't take it anymore. My body moved before my mind could catch up, and I bolted out of bed, tearing down the hall, shouting for everyone to wake up. Ethan, Marcus, and Daniel stumbled out of their rooms, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" Ethan muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Someone's knocking on my window," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The fear had taken over now, making my voice shake. Without wasting a second, we grabbed flashlights and stormed outside. The cold night air hit us as we scanned the deck, the beach, the sides of the house. Nothing. No footprints in the sand, no shadows lurking in the distance. It was as if no one had been there at all. "Are you sure it wasn't just the wind or something?" Daniel asked, trying to sound calm but clearly unnerved. "I know what I heard," I shot back, my voice trembling. I explained to them about the figure on the beach, then on the deck, and how it had been standing right outside my window. We checked everywhere, even the empty beach, stretching endlessly in both directions, but there was no sign of anyone. Finally, we gave up and went back inside, locking every door and window again. Ethan suggested we leave the deck lights on, just in case, and no one argued. But even with the lights flooding the backyard, sleep felt impossible. The next morning, the tension hadn't lifted. There was an uneasy quiet between all of us, as if we all wanted to pretend nothing weird had happened, but couldn't quite shake it off. Just to be safe, Ethan and I went to the two closest neighbors to ask if they'd noticed anything strange recently. One of the neighbors, a grizzled older man, leaned against his door frame, eyeing us with a strange mix of curiosity and dread. "You too, huh?" he said, when we explained what had happened. He told us that, just a week ago, someone had knocked on his door in the dead of night. He called out, asking who it was, but no one answered. They just kept knocking, slow and steady. Eventually the knocking stopped, but he never opened the door to see who or what it was. The weight of his story hung heavy over us as we headed back to the house. If someone, or something, had been creeping around the neighborhood, it wasn't just a one-time thing. We tried to enjoy the rest of our time there. We spent the day at the beach, hit a few nearby towns, and pretended everything was normal. But the atmosphere had shifted. Every time we looked at the water, every creak of the house at night, it was like a reminder that something had been watching us, and it wasn't finished. That final night was eerily quiet. No knocking, no strange figures, nothing out of the ordinary. But as we packed up and drove away the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been lucky, that whatever was out there had chosen to leave us alone. For now. And even now, back in the safety of my own home, I still think about that night, about the knocks, about the figure that disappeared before Ethan could see it. Part of me wonders, what would I have seen if I had lifted the blind? But another part, the part that keeps me awake some nights, is thankful that I never did. I was 9 years old when it happened. It was one of those rare nights when I was home alone, and I remember feeling grown up about it, like I had some kind of responsibility. My mom was out running errands, probably grocery shopping or picking up my little sister from a friend's house. It wasn't unusual, but she never left me alone for long. I didn't mind, though. I spent the evening in my room, deeply absorbed in Metroid Prime on my GameCube, a game I couldn't get enough of back then. The hours slipped by, and I was so focused on beating a boss level that I almost didn't hear the house phone ringing downstairs. My mom had a strict rule: always pick up the phone when she called, just in case she needed to reach me for something important. So I reluctantly paused my game and rushed downstairs, grabbing the phone just before it went to voicemail. The caller ID showed my mom's cell number, but as soon as I answered, something felt off. "Sweetie, can you come outside and help me with the groceries?" she asked. It was my mom's voice, or at least it sounded like it, but not quite. There was a strange flatness to it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated for a second before asking, "Mom, why do you sound like that?" There was a pause on the other end. Then, in the same unsettling tone, she replied, "Like what, sweetie?" That word. Asterisk. Sweetie. Asterisk. My mom never called me that. She wouldn't use it once, let alone twice in one conversation. My heart started pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. Something wasn't right. I didn't know how or why, but I just knew. Without saying another word, I hung up the phone. Suddenly, being home alone didn't feel so grown up anymore. The phone rang again, my mom's number flashing on the caller ID once more. This time. I didn't pick it up. My heart was racing, though I wasn't sure why exactly. Something about the voice pretending to be my mom. Something about the way it said, asterisk, sweetie. Asterisk had set off every alarm bell in my body. I sat there, frozen in the kitchen, staring at the phone, waiting, hoping it wouldn't ring again. But it did. A third time. Only now, the number was different. With shaking hands, I picked it up, cautiously pressing the phone to my ear. "Hey, James," a man's voice said, unnervingly calm. "I know this is going to sound weird, but it's your dad. I'm outside." I went cold. I could barely breathe. My dad had died when I was 3. I didn't even have memories of him, just stories and old photos. There was no way this could be him. "What?" I muttered, barely able to form the word. The voice repeated itself. "I'm outside, James. I have a lot to explain." My whole body felt like it was sinking. This wasn't real. It asterisk couldn't asterisk be real. I slammed the phone down, my hand trembling as fear took hold. Whoever had called before, pretending to be my mom, had to be the same person now pretending to be my dad. They had her phone. They were outside. The phone rang again, the same number as before, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing. How did they know my name? How did they get her phone? What did they want? Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, more of a soft tap on the front door, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I slowly moved to the corner of the kitchen, peering around the wall just enough to see the front door. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. "James, it's your dad," the man's voice called from the other side. "I need to talk to you." The doorbell rang, and then the sound of the doorknob jiggling filled the air. He was trying to get in. I backed away, my hands shaking, and that's when I heard it. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable. Coming from outside too. She was whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. My mind was screaming, telling me to run, to hide, to do something, anything. I couldn't stay in the open like this. Without thinking, I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. My voice was trembling as I explained the situation to the operator, who told me to lock myself in a room until the police arrived. The only room downstairs with a lock was the bathroom. The knocking continued as I slipped into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I crouched down, listening intently. Whoever was outside was moving, circling the house. I heard them at the windows now, trying each one. They were checking for a way in. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find one. The gentle taps on the front door escalated quickly, turning into aggressive, desperate pounding. My heart pounded in sync with each knock, and I couldn't stop shaking. From around the corner of the kitchen, I barely peeked out, just enough to see the door shuddering from the force of the knocks. The man's voice, muffled but clear, called my name again. "James, it's your dad. Open up." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. My real dad was long gone. This was someone pretending, trying to get me to open the door. The doorbell rang next, a frantic chime, and then the doorknob began to rattle. He was trying to force his way in. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling. I whispered everything to the operator, my voice barely above a breath. She kept me calm, her voice steady and reassuring, telling me to hide somewhere safe. The only room downstairs with a lock was the bathroom, so I ran for it, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I crouched in the dark, holding my breath, my ear pressed against the door. The house fell quiet for a moment, but then I heard the sounds again, the faint scraping of hands on glass. They were at the windows now, checking each one, trying to find a way in. Every time I heard the clink of a window being tested, I felt a fresh surge of fear. I thanked whatever luck I had that every window was locked, but I knew if even one wasn't, this would have ended differently. The minutes dragged by like hours. My body was frozen, my mind filled with terror, imagining what would happen if they got inside. Every sound made me flinch. Each creak of the house, each gust of wind outside. I didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest noise would give me away. Then suddenly, the attempt stopped. No more knocks. No more rattling at the windows. Silence. My breath was shallow as I waited in the dark, afraid to believe that it was over. After what felt like an eternity, the operator's voice came back on the line. "The police are there now, sweetie. It's safe to come out." I unlocked the bathroom door as quietly as I could and crept into the hallway. The red and blue lights flashing through the windows felt like a lifeline. And when I opened the front door, I was met by 2 officers standing on the porch. Relief washed over me as I stepped outside. They had come, just in time. The police did a quick search of the house and the yard, but whoever had been outside was long gone by then. The officers asked me a series of questions. Who else was supposed to be home if my mom knew anyone who might want to hurt us? But I had no answers. All I could say was that my mom was out grocery shopping and that her phone had been stolen. When my mom finally pulled up to the house, her face was pale with panic. Seeing the police cars and me standing there was enough to send her into a frenzy. After calming her down, the officers explained that her phone had likely been taken earlier that evening, which explained how the strangers knew so much about us. Her phone had pictures of my sister and me on the home screen, probably enough to make them realize she was a single mom with young kids. They had used that information to try and lure me out of the house. To this day, I still don't know who those people were or what they planned to do if they had gotten in. The thought alone still makes my skin crawl. All I know is that they were willing to pretend to be my parents just to get me to open the door. After that night, everything changed. My mom never left me alone at night again, not until I was much older. Even now, years later, whenever the phone rings, I feel a flicker of that old fear, that deep, unsettling feeling that whoever's calling might not be who they say they are.